Cheating millionaire husband begs pregnant wife for money, but she shuts him down with a bold move. Who would ever believe that an ultra-successful millionaire could be so desperate and yet so completely alone? This is the story of Dominic Blackwood, a man who built an empire with his charm and connections, only to watch it all teeter on the edge of collapse when his darkest secrets came to light. At the center of his downfall is Victoria Blackwood, his devoted, pregnant wife who sacrificed her own dreams to stand by him until she discovered his cruel betrayals. Now, with everything on the line, Dominic begs her for one last lifeline. What she does next will leave everyone stunned, and him begging for mercy. Dominic Blackwood was not born into wealth. Far from it. He grew up in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Buffalo, New York, sharing his tiny room with two siblings. His mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, and his father, once a factory laborer, fell sick with a lung condition that rendered him unable to work. Dominic knew struggle and scarcity all too well. From a tender age, he vowed to himself that he would never be poor again, no matter what it took. When Dominic turned 19, he got his first taste of ambition. He stumbled upon an online business course promising that anyone with the right hustle could become a millionaire. He poured what little money he had into the course and devoured every word. What the course lacked in substance, Dominic made up for with his relentless drive. He discovered he had a knack for persuasion, a smooth talker with an electrifying presence. He started day trading small amounts, flipping products on eBay, and scouring garage sales for valuable finds he could resell. It was modest money, but it taught him lessons he'd carry for the rest of his life: how to spot opportunity, build relationships, and leverage every contact into something bigger. But Dominic wasn't satisfied with small-time hustles. He had larger ambitions. By the time he was 23, he had already moved to Manhattan, taking on commissions for a high-end real estate brokerage. Although the competition was fierce, Dominic soared. He approached every client like a close friend, memorizing the birthdays of their children, the details of their favorite vacation spots, and even the name of their pets. Clients loved him. They felt heard and special, and thus they recommended him at every turn. Word of mouth became Dominic's biggest ally. With each big sale, he collected heavier commissions. By the time he turned 25, he was a minor celebrity in certain elite circles. Known for closing deals nobody else could. That was the year he met Victoria Davison at a charity function hosted at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. Victoria was there on behalf of a non-profit organization, raising funds to build schools in underprivileged areas. Dominic had been invited by a wealthy developer who admired his sales genius. The moment Dominic locked eyes with Victoria, it was as if everything else in the ornate ballroom went dark. She was elegant yet approachable, standing near a silent auction table with a clipboard in hand, gently persuading donors to support her cause. Her compassion radiated an authentic warmth that made everyone around her feel both welcome and inspired. Dominic found himself drawn to her sincerity, a quality he rarely encountered in his dog-eat-dog real estate world. He introduced himself, and their conversation flowed like they had known each other for years. That very night, they found themselves walking beneath the glittering streetlights of Midtown Manhattan, sharing their life stories. Victoria was a graduate of Columbia University with a background in social work. She came from a stable middle-class family, but carried a resolute passion for doing good in the world. Dominic was awed by her altruistic spirit. Meanwhile, Victoria was enraptured by his raw ambition and backstory of rising from poverty into success. It wasn't long before they fell in love. Where Dominic had once lived for the thrill of closing the next big deal, he found himself daydreaming about a life shared with Victoria. Her presence softened his edges and made him think beyond money and power. Even though he was still climbing the ladder, Dominic began envisioning a future that involved not just wealth, but also family, philanthropy, and real, lasting happiness. Their courtship was swift. Within a year, they were engaged, exchanging rings in a private moment during a moonlit stroll in Central Park. He sealed his promise with a tearful vow. He would never forget the kindness she had shown him. He would never stray from the devotion he felt for her. That vow seemed unbreakable at the time. Not long after, they married in a lavish ceremony at a vineyard in the Hudson Valley. Dominic's star was on the rise in real estate, and Victoria was expanding her reach in the non-profit sector, working to fund schools and libraries in impoverished neighborhoods. They seemed like the perfect match. Friends joked they were unstoppable, a power couple destined to change both the corporate and charitable worlds. But wealth has a way of altering even the most steadfast hearts. As Dominic's bank account overflowed, so did his ego. He began longing for more than financial success. He craved adoration, admiration, power, and the sense that he could conquer anything or anyone. Over the next few years, he branched out from real estate into tech startups and, notably, took a major stake in Tesla stocks. Every move he made turned to gold. He was unstoppable, or so he thought. Victoria watched Dominic's transformation with a mix of pride and concern. She admired his genius and was grateful that he shared his success with her family and various charities. But she sensed a dangerous edge to his rising fame. He started arriving home later, brushing off dinners and obligations, explaining he was this close to landing yet another game-changing deal. Her attempts to caution him about the trappings of wealth were shrugged off. To Dominic, money was more than a tool. It was proof he had transcended the hardship of his childhood. What Victoria did not realize was that as Dominic's net worth soared, he began receiving attention from all sorts of people, especially women who found his confidence and fortune irresistible. The faithful vow he had made beneath the Central Park moonlight began to fade from memory. Before long, Dominic was stepping closer and closer to the line of indiscretion. Yet, at this early stage, the outside world saw nothing but success. Dominic's name was being mentioned in the same breath as Manhattan's top real estate moguls. Magazine covers, speaking engagements, interviews. He was lauded as the self-made man who started from nothing and conquered New York. The public had no clue that behind closed doors, the cracks had already begun to form in his marriage. Success can become an addiction, and for Dominic, it was a narcotic more potent than any drug. He thrived off the thrill of negotiations, the heady rush of victory when he closed deals worth millions. With each new success, he found himself drawn further away from Victoria. By now, she was used to eating dinner alone, and yet she believed in him. She told herself that his long hours and incessant travel were just sacrifices they both had to make so he could eventually slow down and build the family life they'd always talked about. Privately, Dominic convinced himself that every questionable step he took was justified. He rationalized that since he was the provider, he had to be relentless. If he flirted a bit too much with a potential client who happened to be an attractive heiress, it was all part of the job. If he lingered in bars after networking events, well, that was how deals got done. If he thought about other women, it was only natural for a man of his success and stature. All these excuses gradually eroded the lines of loyalty he once held so dear. It was around this time that Dominic discovered a new playground for his wealth: high-stakes poker games in private clubs scattered across Manhattan. These exclusive gatherings were frequented by hedge fund managers, trust fund heirs, and celebrities seeking anonymity. Dominic's presence was welcomed new money that wanted to brush shoulders with old money. The adrenaline rush of winning thousands in a single hand paralleled the excitement he felt when finalizing $1 million real estate deal. The difference was that gambling had its own allure, free from the constraints of the legal or business worlds. It was dangerously seductive. Victoria, worried about his late nights, tried to confront him. She was well aware that many of these high rollers had vices, drugs, women, and crippling debts hidden under polished exteriors. But Dominic shrugged her off, telling her that any man in his position had to rub elbows with the wealthy. Didn't she understand, after all, that success meant playing the game both literally and figuratively? Concerned, Victoria insisted that they take a weekend away at their beach house to reconnect. Dominic agreed reluctantly. But even during those 2 days, his phone never stopped buzzing. Whenever she tried to cuddle up with him on the balcony overlooking the water, he excused himself to take important calls. Beneath the veneer of her smile, Victoria battled an ominous feeling that something was terribly wrong. She tried to brush it aside, hoping that his behavior was just a phase. After all, Dominic was still generous with his money, still supported her non-profit endeavors, and he assured her that once he reached a certain milestone, he'd slow down and focus on the marriage. She held on to hope, unable to see the storm on the horizon. Behind the scenes, Dominic's social circle had expanded to include people of questionable character, men and women who prided themselves on flaunting money in the most ostentatious ways. It wasn't just the gambling. There were private yachts where anything went, penthouse parties that lasted until the first light of dawn, and a lavish lifestyle that blurred moral boundaries. Dominic began traveling to places like Miami and Los Angeles under the guise of investment opportunities. But in reality, he was chasing pleasure. Often, he found himself in the company of women who were more than eager to bask in the glow of his wealth and influence. One such woman was Isabel. She was a rising star in the modeling world, known for her striking features and an Instagram feed boasting hundreds of thousands of followers. They met at a luxury watch event in Beverly Hills. Dominic was there to broker a partnership for one of his new ventures, and Isabel was a celebrity guest. Their conversation started innocently enough, revolving around business, but the sparks flew quickly. Isabel was drawn to Dominic's swagger, the way he could charm a room full of people without breaking a sweat. Dominic, in turn, found her beauty intoxicating. That night, after the watch event, he joined a small after-party where Isabel's friends gathered in a penthouse suite. Drinks flowed freely, inhibitions dissolved, and Dominic found himself flirting openly with Isabel. Days later, they exchanged messages. Weeks later, those messages turned into clandestine meetings. Before he knew it, Dominic was slipping out of New York for business trips that were, in reality, romantic getaways with Isabel. Though his conscience pricked him, he numbed it by telling himself he deserved a little excitement after all his years of hustling and grinding. During this time, Victoria stood as a pillar of unwavering support from afar, texting Dominic messages of love and well wishes for his meetings. She assumed he was fighting to expand their financial empire. Little did she know that the only fight he was truly engaged in was with his own crumbling moral fiber. The mild guilt he felt would be temporarily soothed by Isabel's presence or the winning of a big poker pot. The cycle repeated, each time further cementing his betrayal. Yet ironically, Dominic never stopped claiming he loved Victoria. In the twisted logic of a man intoxicated by power and indulgence, he separated the two women in his mind. Victoria was the loyal, kind-hearted wife who had been there when he had nothing. Isabel was the thrilling escape from day-to-day responsibilities, an indulgence that stroked his ego. He saw no immediate conflict because he believed he could keep the affair hidden and maintain the facade of a perfect marriage. Fate, however, always has a way of exposing secrets. All it took was a single slip, a casual mention by one of Dominic's acquaintances at a social gathering that set the gears of suspicion turning in Victoria's mind. She started paying closer attention to Dominic's credit card statements, his phone calls, his demeanor when he returned from business trips. Something wasn't adding up, and it pained her to even consider that he might be unfaithful. But the signals were growing louder, impossible to ignore. Still, Victoria tried to handle it rationally. She confronted Dominic with her concerns late one evening when he strolled into their penthouse apartment in Manhattan, well past midnight. His tie was askew, his eyes bloodshot. She begged him to come clean if there was something he needed to share. He scoffed at her concerns, telling her she was overreacting. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Victoria went to sleep alone, tears soaking her pillow. Dominic convinced himself that as long as he denied everything, she would eventually believe him. After all, he had never failed at convincing anyone of anything. This was just another negotiation, right? The seeds of betrayal were planted deep, but neither Dominic nor Victoria knew just how catastrophic the harvest would be. A few weeks later, Victoria noticed she was late. Her cycle hadn't come. Ordinarily, this would have been cause for celebration. She had always wanted children. She had dreamed of being a mother for as long as she could remember. Nervously, she purchased a pregnancy test on her lunch break and took it in the office bathroom. Her heart pounded as she stared at the test window, which revealed two bold pink lines. Joy, fear, and a cascade of unprocessed emotions swept over her. That evening, she prepared a special dinner to tell Dominic the news. She set out candles, placed a small gift box on the table containing baby booties, and waited. She wanted to make this moment as memorable as possible, hoping it would rekindle their bond. He showed up nearly 3 hours late, stumbling through the door, the stench of whiskey on his breath. The dinner was cold, the candles had burned down to nubs. Still, Victoria attempted to muster a smile and present the baby booties, her voice trembling with both anticipation and unease. Dominic, half tipsy, stared at the gift with confusion. When it dawned on him that Victoria was announcing her pregnancy, he mustered a half-hearted, "That's great news." He hugged her, but his embrace felt mechanical. Despite her disappointment in his reaction, Victoria tried to remain positive. Perhaps he was just surprised, caught off guard after a long night of business discussions. She clung to the hope that once the news settled, he would come around, but in the days that followed, Dominic seemed more distant than ever. Instead of reveling in the idea of fatherhood, he appeared consumed by something else. He spent more time texting someone late at night, a guarded expression on his face whenever she walked past. Victoria's suspicions only grew. Her pregnancy hormones amplified every feeling. She felt more vulnerable, more anxious, and more determined to protect her future child. One morning, after Dominic left his phone on the kitchen table to take a shower, Victoria found herself wrestling with the moral dilemma of whether to look through his messages. She despised the thought of invading his privacy, yet her intuition screamed that something was amiss, and she felt a responsibility to her unborn child to uncover the truth. With trembling hands, she tapped in the passcode, his birthday. He hadn't even bothered to change it. What she saw on the screen shook her to the core. Thread after thread of messages to Isabel, including heart emojis, explicit photos, and plans for secret rendezvous. Victoria felt her world collapse around her. Every sentiment of trust shattered into tiny, irretrievable fragments. She scrolled through evidence of an affair that had been going on for months, possibly even longer. There were mentions of high-end hotels in Los Angeles and weekends in Miami. He had flown Isabel first class, wined and dined her at the finest restaurants, and even bought her expensive jewelry. The lavishness of Dominic's betrayal was nauseating. Victoria snapped photo after photo of the incriminating texts using her own phone. Her hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped it. She wanted to confront him right then, to scream at him as soon as he stepped out of the shower. But a moment of clarity took hold. This wasn't just about her heartbreak. She had an unborn child to consider. If Dominic had lied about this, what else could he be lying about? Money? Business deals? She needed to gather her thoughts, plan carefully, and protect herself and the baby. When Dominic emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, Victoria had already composed herself enough to pretend she was fine. She glanced at him, forcing a smile. He casually picked up his phone from the kitchen table, completely oblivious to what had just transpired. Victoria excused herself, saying she needed to visit a friend. She left the apartment, fighting the urge to sob, until she was in a taxi, out of earshot of Dominic. That night, she stayed at a hotel under a friend's name, needing space to decide her next move. It took every ounce of her resolve not to confront him immediately. Part of her wanted to lash out, to throw the evidence of his betrayal in his face. But she recognized that Dominic was a cunning negotiator, adept at twisting the truth to suit his narrative. If she acted rashly, she risked letting him manipulate her emotions, or worse, threaten her with financial ruin if she sought a divorce. The pregnancy had changed everything. She needed to be strategic, not just outraged. So Victoria did what she did best. She started researching. She contacted a family friend who was a lawyer, explaining the broad strokes of her situation without revealing names. The friend advised her to gather as much financial documentation as possible: bank statements, property deeds, business records before making any moves. If Dominic was unfaithful, there might also be issues with how he was handling their joint assets. Victoria returned to the penthouse the next day, resolved to find the answers she needed without arousing his suspicion. Over the next week, she played the part of the dutiful wife perfectly, even as her stomach churned with morning sickness and heartbreak. She told Dominic she was thinking of quitting her non-profit job to focus on the pregnancy, claiming she wanted to ensure a stress-free environment for the baby. He seemed relieved, perhaps assuming that her stepping away from the workforce would make her even more dependent on him. Little did he know that this new freedom gave her ample time to investigate his financial dealings. She pored over credit card statements, wire transfers, and investment portfolios. She discovered shocking discrepancies. Dominic had been funneling money into offshore accounts, presumably to hide winnings from his gambling escapades or to bankroll his lavish lifestyle with Isabel. Their joint bank accounts, which she assumed contained enough for both of them to live comfortably for years, were not as flush as they appeared. He had been moving funds around, using her name as a co-signer for risky investments without her knowledge. The more she uncovered, the angrier she became. This was not just a betrayal of her trust, it was a betrayal of their unborn child's future and their mutual financial stability. She realized Dominic had become addicted to risk, not just in gambling or in secret trysts, but in his entire approach to life. He believed he was invincible, that no matter how deep he dug himself into a hole, he could charm his way out of it. Victoria vowed to show him otherwise, but she needed a plan. A single confrontation would not suffice to safeguard her and her baby. She needed to ensure that Dominic faced the consequences of his actions. Step by step, she prepared. She met with her lawyer friend again, this time sharing details. She learned about prenuptial agreements, how to freeze certain assets, and what might happen in a divorce settlement. And while it broke her heart to even consider dissolving her marriage, she knew it might be the only way to protect herself and her child from Dominic's reckless behavior. By the end of that week, Victoria had gathered enough evidence to obliterate Dominic's claims of innocence. But She was not yet ready to strike. She wanted him to feel the uncertainty, the dread, and the same sense of betrayal that haunted her every waking hour. There was also a part of her, however small, that remembered the earnest young man who had proposed to her under moonlit skies. She wrestled with her emotions. Was there room for forgiveness, for a chance at redemption? Or was it too late, the damage far too extensive to ever be repaired? When Victoria approached Dominic one morning, suggesting that they attend couples therapy for the baby's sake, he shrugged it off, scoffing that they were too busy for that nonsense. If there had been any lingering doubt in her mind, his dismissive attitude sealed it. He wasn't interested in healing their marriage. He simply wanted to maintain appearances. She decided then and there that she would not only confront him, but also secure her rightful share of their assets to provide for herself and the baby, come what may. The path forward was fraught with uncertainty, but she felt a surge of empowerment coursing through her veins. For once, she was done playing the passive wife. She was ready to reclaim her life from the man who had so callously abused her trust. The chance for a face-to-face showdown arrived sooner than Victoria expected. Dominic, who had scheduled yet another business trip to Los Angeles, was preparing to leave on a Friday evening. She noticed the excitement in his voice as he told her about the client dinner he had lined up. She knew exactly who he planned to meet, Isabel. She also knew that he had purchased a diamond necklace set from Tiffany & Company, intending to surprise his mistress. Moments before Dominic was to head to the airport, Victoria stepped into the living room, her face solemn. "We need to talk," she said, standing with her arms crossed over her chest. Her tone left no room for negotiation. Dominic looked at his watch, feigning impatience. "Victoria, I have a flight. Cancel it," she cut him off. "This is urgent." Sensing something big was amiss, Dominic hesitated but ultimately sat down on the edge of the sofa. Victoria took a seat across from him, maintaining her distance. She took out her phone, where she had stored the images of his texts with Isabel, along with records of questionable financial transactions. One by one, she began presenting the evidence, screenshots of his messages, copies of receipts for lavish gifts, and statements from offshore accounts. Dominic's face went pale. His initial reaction was to deny everything, but the tidal wave of proof rendered his words hollow. He tried to stutter out an explanation, saying it was a misunderstanding, that the woman was just a friend, that the offshore accounts were legitimate investments. He even tried to gaslight Victoria, claiming she was overreacting, but each lie tripped over the next, and Victoria refused to be swayed. She had the facts, and she had the steely resolve to hold him accountable. When it became clear he couldn't talk his way out of it, Dominic's demeanor shifted from denial to desperation. He got on his knees in front of her, pleading, "Vicky, I'm sorry, I messed up. It was a stupid, meaningless fling. I swear, it didn't mean anything. It's you I love." "I've just been under so much stress." Victoria recoiled from his touch. The tears that she had fought so hard to keep in had begun to fall, but she refused to let them weaken her resolve. "Don't you dare use love as a shield," she spat, her voice quivering with rage. "You betrayed me, Dominic. You betrayed our child, our future, everything we built together." His eyes, brimming with tears of his own, darted around as though searching for a lifeline. "We can fix this," he pleaded. "I'll stop seeing her. I'll close those offshore accounts. I'll do anything you say. Just give me a chance." She stared at him, remembering their early days, the charitable events, the nights they spent dreaming of a better world, their vow under the stars in Central Park. How had it come to this? Her heart felt heavy with the weight of a broken dream, but she also recalled the countless nights she waited up for him, her lonely dinners, the stress and suspicion that gnawed at her pregnancy. She recalled the smug look on his face whenever she tried to question him. In that moment, she realized there was no going back. She couldn't trust him. "Pack your things," she said, each word crisp and final. "I want you out of this house tonight." Dominic tried to resist. "But this is my house. I paid for this penthouse." "We both paid for it," she retorted, reminding him that her name was on the deed, that she had contributed her inheritance to their initial down payment. "You can go to a hotel, or you can stay with your mistress, makes no difference to me." Seeing her unyielding glare, Dominic knew she meant every word. He tried to hug her, but she shrank away. He begged her to let him stay, promising he would fix it all. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Isabel, calling to confirm he hadn't missed the flight. He stared at the screen, face twisted in panic, unsure whether to answer. Victoria scoffed at the sight, her contempt palpable. He left the penthouse that night with a small suitcase, the rest of his belongings still scattered around the apartment. Though he had once been unstoppable, the king of negotiations, in that moment he was reduced to a desperate man without a plan. Victoria didn't shed another tear in his presence. She locked the door, sank onto the sofa, and sobbed until her chest hurt, the weight of heartbreak pressing upon her like a physical burden. Yet through her tears she felt a new sensation, the stirrings of relief and a spark of empowerment. She had done what needed to be done. Word of Dominic's exile spread quickly among their social circle. Some were shocked, others secretly murmured that they had seen it coming. The rumor mill churned out wild theories about the nature of his affair, the scale of his gambling, and the reasons for the split. Meanwhile, Dominic was scrambling. He tried to call Victoria multiple times a day, leaving messages apologizing, crying, swearing he would do better. After a while, her phone would buzz and display his name, but she refused to answer. She had heard it all before. She returned to her lawyer friend, who guided her through the process of what might come next. Dominic's finances were more entangled than she had realized. He owed money to some unsavory people from the underworld of high-stakes gambling. Additionally, certain real estate deals he'd orchestrated teetered on the brink of collapse. The empire he had so carefully built was beginning to crumble, and ironically, it happened just as Victoria had kicked him out. Fate or karma, call it what you will, the timing was impeccable. The final nail in Dominic's coffin came when one of his biggest investors pulled out of a multi-million-dollar real estate project, citing concerns about Dominic's personal scandal and the potential risk to the business. Suddenly, the unstoppable mogul found himself strapped for cash, struggling to keep up with mortgage payments on multiple properties, and potentially facing lawsuits from jilted partners. Desperate, he reached out to Victoria again, asking her to help him stave off financial ruin. She was, after all, still his wife. Couldn't she just sign a few documents, or loan him some funds, so he could shore up his accounts? By this point, Victoria had truly seen the extent of his betrayal and greed. She refused to get involved in shady deals, let alone risk the security of her unborn child's future to bail him out. Yet Dominic persisted, growing more frantic by the day. He attempted to manipulate her emotionally, reminding her of all the good times they shared, the life they had once dreamed of. But Victoria saw through his lies. His pleas weren't about love or regret. They were about survival. He needed her money. He needed her stability. Amid this whirlwind, Victoria felt the life inside her growing each day. She focused on her pregnancy, hiring a doula, attending prenatal classes, and planning for the baby's arrival. Though it was terrifying to face motherhood alone, she found solace in the fact that she was finally free of Dominic's deceit. She could breathe without wondering where he was or who he was with. For the first time in a long while, she felt in control of her destiny. In the weeks that followed, Dominic experienced a humbling fall from grace. Debts mounted. Many of the so-called friends who once flocked to him for lavish parties and yacht trips vanished the moment his money troubles became public. Rumors swirled that some of his real estate investments were sinking fast, that his offshore accounts were under legal scrutiny, and that a major lawsuit loomed from a business partner who claimed Dominic had misrepresented certain financials. Even Isabel, the woman he had risked his marriage for, grew distant when she realized the golden goose might be running out of gold. Every time Dominic tried to salvage his businesses, he faced another setback. Banks were unwilling to issue large loans without Victoria co-signing, as she still owned significant shares in certain ventures. Partners were wary of continuing with him because of his spiraling reputation. It was as though the entire foundation he built upon lies was finally collapsing under its own weight. And with each piece that fell, Dominic felt more desperate. He called Victoria once again, tears lacing his voice, telling her that he understood if she hated him, but that he needed her help for the sake of their unborn child. "Think of the baby," he pleaded. "You want our kid to have a father who can provide. If I go under, everything falls apart." She listened, her stomach churning. The mention of the baby was the final straw. "Don't you dare use our child to manipulate me," she snapped. "You lost the right to my help when you broke every promise you ever made." "But I'm your husband," he cried, his tone brimming with indignation and despair. She paused, her knuckles white around the phone. "For now," she said coldly, "but that's temporary." Then she ended the call. The next day, Dominic attempted one final desperate move. He showed up unannounced at the penthouse. Victoria opened the door cautiously, her eyes narrowing at the sight of him unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, hair disheveled. He looked nothing like the polished, suave millionaire she had once known. In his hand, he clutched a folder of documents. He begged her to just look at them, to sign them, ensuring a short-term loan that could hold him over until his next big deal closed. She could remain a silent partner, he promised, and would get her money back with interest. He assured her it was foolproof. Victoria took one glance at the folder before handing it back. "I will not sign anything for you, Dominic," she said, stepping back to close the door. He wedged his foot between the door and the frame, his voice cracking as he pleaded, "Please, Victoria, if I don't get this loan, I'm ruined." She stared him in the eye, her resolve unbreakable. "You already ruined yourself," she answered. Then she firmly pushed his foot aside, shutting the door and locking it. Alone in the hallway, Dominic felt the sting of shame and the sting of heartbreak. For the first time, he realized the full gravity of his actions. He had turned the one person who genuinely loved him into an enemy, all for the sake of fleeting thrills and an insatiable ego. Before he knew it, hot tears streamed down his face, but there was no one left to console him. That night, he checked into a cheap motel room because he couldn't afford to keep staying at five-star hotels on a dwindling credit line. How quickly fortunes could turn. Weeks turned into months. Victoria's pregnancy advanced, and she prepared for single motherhood. However, she was no victim. She took the time to meet financial planners, set up new bank accounts, and reposition assets in her name. Thanks to her proactive measures, she had enough liquidity to live comfortably and support her child for the foreseeable future. She consulted with her lawyer about divorce proceedings, carefully timing her next steps so as not to jeopardize her or the baby's well-being. Meanwhile, Dominic spiraled further. Lawsuits, debt collectors, and even a few threatening messages from shady characters he owed gambling debts to became his reality. His cell phone hardly worked, he'd missed payments, and he had to sell off his flashy sports cars at a loss. Isabel, no longer impressed by his faltering bank account, had conveniently moved on to another wealthy suitor. Alone and cornered, Dominic had no choice but to humble himself. Then, one fateful afternoon, Victoria's contractions began. She was rushed to the hospital by a neighbor, as Dominic was nowhere to be found, and she had long since removed him from her emergency contact list. After an arduous labor, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Holding her son in her arms, she felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. She decided then and there that she would never let him be used or hurt by Dominic's greed. Word eventually reached Dominic that Victoria had given birth. Full of anxiety and remorse, he mustered the courage to go to the hospital. But by the time he arrived, she was already discharged. He tracked her down at the penthouse a few days later, hoping to see his child. Victoria, exhausted yet radiant with maternal love, allowed Dominic inside for a moment. The sight of him holding their tiny baby tugged at her heart, reminding her of what might have been. But her resolve remained steadfast. She informed him that she had already filed for divorce and that she would be seeking full custody. Dominic looked shattered, tears filling his eyes as he cradled the infant. "Please, I'll change. I'll be a better father, a better husband." She gently took the baby back from him, her expression neutral. "You've had countless chances," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is the consequence of your actions." Desperate, Dominic then launched into a new plea. His bank accounts were frozen due to ongoing investigations, and he needed financial help to secure a decent apartment, pay legal fees, and clean up his looming debts. He swore he wanted to create a stable environment for the baby. Couldn't Victoria spare some money, for their son's sake if not for him? In that moment, Victoria realized how far he had fallen. The once confident, charismatic millionaire now stood before her, humbled and broken, begging for money. She felt a pang of pity, but also a surge of indignation. Her mind drifted to the memory of those texts with Isabel, the lies, the nights she spent alone, his dismissive attitude toward her concerns, the emotional pain he inflicted upon her during pregnancy. She looked at the delicate face of her newborn, then at Dominic. "I'm not your bank," she said, her voice cold. "I'm the mother of your child, and your wife in name, only until these papers are finalized. I will not fund your reckless lifestyle or bail you out of the mess you created." He stumbled over his words. But I have nowhere else to go. I'm drowning in debt. Just a loan, Vicky. I'll repay it." She shook her head. "No, this time you face the consequences on your own." With that, she turned away, indicating that their conversation was over. A whirlwind of events followed. The media got wind of Dominic's downfall, printing headlines about the disgraced real estate mogul who lost everything. Business partners sued him for breach of contract. Gambling dens threatened him, and his personal properties were repossessed or sold at auction. The life he had once displayed so proudly on social media, flashing wads of cash, posing with celebrities, was gone. One day, as Victoria was recovering from childbirth, she received a phone call from one of Dominic's lawyers. He claimed Dominic had been hospitalized after an altercation with a loan shark to whom he owed a substantial sum. Victoria felt a twinge of guilt, wondering if she should visit. But the lawyer clarified that Dominic's condition was stable, though his finances were in worse shape than ever. "He doesn't have anyone else to turn to," the lawyer noted. "He asked me to see if you'd be willing to help him." Victoria closed her eyes, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. The father of her child was in trouble, lying in a hospital bed, apparently alone. She decided to go, not out of love those feelings had been crushed, but out of a sense of responsibility and closure. She arranged for a babysitter, took a taxi to the hospital, and found Dominic in a private room with a bandage on his arm and a bruised face. The once self-assured man now looked older, his hair unkempt, eyes hollow. He gazed at her with remorse. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for everything." She crossed her arms, staying a few feet away from his bed. "I know," she replied quietly. He went on to explain that he'd borrowed from the wrong people, believing he could double or triple his money quickly to pay off other debts. It was a house of cards that came crashing down. Now he had nothing left. He asked her no, begged her to at least help him settle enough debts so he could avoid another violent confrontation. He insisted this time was different, that he had hit rock bottom and truly learned his lesson. Victoria listened, her face expressionless. The baby was safe at home, cared for by a trusted friend, so she had no illusions about this conversation being about family unity. She recognized Dominic's sincerity in that he was indeed desperate and broken. He might truly regret his sins, but that didn't erase the suffering he had caused. She asked him a direct question. Do you love this baby? Do you truly want to be a father to him? Dominic nodded frantically, tears glistening. Yes, yes, more than anything. And if I say I won't give you a cent, she continued, will you still want to be in his life? Or is this just about money? He paused, his eyes dropping to the hospital bedsheets. In that moment, the silence was deafening. For Dominic, love had always been tied to transactions. He gave lavish gifts, funded extravagant trips, believing that was how to maintain relationships. But real love demanded sacrifice. Real love required him to be there for his child without any financial gain. I would still want to see him, to be there for him, Dominic finally managed to say. I'm ashamed it took me so long to see what's really important. Victoria stared at him for a few moments, weighing his words. She could sense that his sincerity was genuine, at least in that he wanted to be there for his son. But she also recognized that old habits die hard, and trust once shattered is not easily repaired. She handed him a small envelope. Inside are contact details for a reputable financial counselor and a therapist specializing in addiction, including gambling. If you really want to turn your life around, you'll reach out to them. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Thank you, he murmured. But what about no money, Dominic? She said firmly. No more bailouts. You must do this yourself. If you want to be a father, you need to stand on your own 2 feet. That's the only way you'll ever earn my respect or have any place in our child's life. He nodded, tears streaming. In his battered state, it was clear that he had no other choice. For the first time, Dominic truly understood that he had lost the power to manipulate Victoria with charm or guilt. She had given him the gift of direction, a path to redemption that he would have to walk alone. The divorce proceedings continued, and by the time it was finalized, Victoria emerged with primary custody and a fair settlement. She received sole ownership of the penthouse, along with a substantial portion of their remaining legitimate assets. Dominic, having no room to negotiate, accepted the terms. He moved into a modest studio apartment, a far cry from the luxurious lifestyle he once flaunted. Months rolled by, and Dominic began attending therapy sessions for his gambling addiction. He attempted to piece together a new life, free from the illusions of grandeur that once consumed him. He contacted the financial counselor Victoria recommended, trying to negotiate payment plans with creditors. His progress was slow, painful, and riddled with setbacks, but he persisted, fueled by the desire to be a better man for his son. Meanwhile, Victoria flourished as a single mother. She poured her time into her baby, cherishing every moment, the first smile, the first steps, the first words. She also resumed her non-profit work, channeling her passion for helping others into a new project aimed at supporting single mothers. Her story, albeit painful, became a source of inspiration. She wanted to show other women that they could stand strong and thrive even after betrayal. Despite her justified anger, Victoria allowed Dominic supervised visits with their child. She never let him take the boy unsupervised. At least, not initially, but she didn't block the door. Gradually, as she saw Dominic stick to his therapy sessions and heard reports of him holding down a humble but honest consulting job, her stance softened. She remained guarded, but she recognized that a father who was genuinely trying deserved at least a chance to form a bond with his son. Dominic's old acquaintances hardly recognized him now. Gone were the expensive suits and the flashy wristwatches. Instead, he dressed in simple attire, took the subway to work, and carried a battered briefcase with tattered edges. He had discovered a new kind of humility, and though it was humiliating at first, he found a certain peace in living within his means. For the first time, he savored the small victories, making a credit card payment on time, cooking a basic meal, or having a genuine conversation with his young son about the birds outside the window. Nearly a year after the divorce, Dominic's financial situation began to stabilize. He was far from wealthy, but he was making progress. He had even saved up enough to clear some of his most pressing debts. However, one old gambling debt refused to go away, and the threat of legal action or worse loomed. He decided to approach Victoria again. This time, it wasn't to beg for a bailout, but to propose a structured repayment plan if she would lend him a specific sum. He claimed it was the final hurdle, the last chain from his old life that needed severing for him to move forward fully. He requested a meeting at a coffee shop in Midtown. Victoria, somewhat wary, agreed to hear him out. She arrived wearing a simple but elegant blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Gone was the frail, heartbroken woman from before. In her place stood someone strong, confident, and wiser. Dominic presented a neatly organized folder, detailing his monthly budget, the outstanding debt, and how he planned to repay every cent if Victoria chose to lend him the money. His voice trembled as he admitted his past failures, but also expressed genuine hope that he was on the path to real change. "I'm not asking you to do this for me," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to consider doing it for our son, so he doesn't grow up with a father constantly looking over his shoulder in fear." She listened carefully, her face composed. On the one hand, she admired the effort he had put into creating a responsible plan. On the other hand, she remembered the countless lies, the manipulations, and the heartbreak. "Why should I trust you now?" she asked, her gaze level. "How do I know this isn't just another story?" Dominic sighed, glancing down at his coffee cup. "You don't," he admitted. "And that's my burden to bear. I know I've used up every chance I had. All I can say is that I am prepared to keep my word, and if you choose not to help me, I understand." Victoria breathed in, weighing her decision. Her mind flashed back to the night she discovered his affair, the night she kicked him out, the birth of their son alone in that hospital, the unstoppable wave of heartbreak. And yet she also saw how Dominic had slowly, painfully clawed his way back towards some semblance of responsibility. She recognized the man sitting across from her was not the same arrogant millionaire who once scoffed at fidelity and devotion. Still, she wasn't about to blindly hand over her money. "If I do this," she said carefully, "it won't be because you asked. It will be because I believe it's in our son's best interest to have a father free from dangerous entanglements. And you will sign a legally binding contract with interest and a repayment schedule." Dominic nodded, relief flooding his features. "Of course, I'll sign whatever you need. And I'm not making any guarantees about our personal relationship," she continued. "We're co-parents, nothing more." He swallowed hard. "I understand." She left the coffee shop with a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, people can change. She would never forget or fully forgive his betrayal, but if he truly was ready to be a better father, she had a responsibility to let him try. A few weeks after their meeting, legal papers were drawn up. Victoria's lawyers created a formal loan document with interest rates, collateral clauses, and a strict repayment schedule. Dominic signed them without hesitation. True to her word, Victoria transferred the funds necessary to clear his lingering gambling debt. She had learned her lessons. Trust was earned, not given. In the end, Dominic's transformation was gradual but genuine. He threw himself into fatherhood, showing up for visitation days on time, teaching his son simple lessons about the world, reading bedtime stories when allowed. Each time, Victoria stood at a distance, observing. She remained guarded, yet there was a growing respect for the effort he was making. She didn't regret shutting him down when he first came begging. It was that harsh lesson that forced him to confront his worst demons. Karma had its way with Dominic. He lost his fortune, his status, and many so-called friends. But in the rubble of his old life, he discovered something more enduring: humility, accountability, and a love that didn't hinge on luxury or fleeting excitement. He had to learn the hard way that what truly matters cannot be bought or bullied into existence. Victoria, for her part, stood tall as a testament to resilience. She had faced the ultimate betrayal at a time when she was most vulnerable, pregnant, hopeful, trusting. Yet she refused to let that betrayal define her. Instead, she turned it into strength, providing a safe and loving environment for her child, continuing her philanthropic work, and building a future on her own terms. Months later, after Dominic had consistently made his repayment installments and proven himself reliable in co-parenting, Victoria decided on one final symbolic gesture. She wrote him a letter, her own bold move. In the letter, she acknowledged the progress he'd made and expressed cautious optimism about co-parenting their son together. She made it clear that although she would never forget the past, she was willing to cultivate a cordial relationship built on mutual respect. She attached a small key to a safe deposit box, noting that inside was a sealed envelope containing the details of an investment portfolio she had set up for their child's future education. It was her way of saying she trusted him enough to safeguard their son's future with her, but it was also a reminder that she held the keys to that trust. When Dominic received the letter, he wept openly. It was a complicated mixture of regret, gratitude, and a sense of redemption. He wasn't fully absolved. He might never be, but he had a chance to move forward in a new light. And so, the cheating millionaire husband learned the hardest lesson of all. No amount of money could heal the wounds inflicted by betrayal, and no grand gesture could ever undo the heartbreak. True redemption required raw honesty, relentless effort, and the willingness to confront one's darkest flaws. In losing everything, he found the one thing that mattered: the opportunity to be a father who, with enough time and penance, might earn his child's respect and maybe, just maybe, a measure of peace within himself. If you found this story gripping, stay tuned for more riveting tales of love, betrayal, and redemption. Don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback inspires us to craft more heart-pounding narratives. Subscribe to our channel for new content that delves into the raw emotions and unexpected turns of life's most dramatic moments. Here, you'll discover stories that make you root for the underdog, question the nature of relationships, and celebrate the power of perseverance. Remember, your support helps this channel grow and ensures we can keep bringing you the compelling stories you crave. So go ahead, like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable journeys that will tug at your heartstrings, keep you on the edge of your seat, and remind you that sometimes rock bottom is just the beginning of a second chance.